The townspeople of Cedar Falls whispered that Alina Hartwell was cursed. First, her husband died in a mining accident just 2 years after their wedding. Then, one by one, 5 orphan children appeared at her doorstep like broken birds seeking shelter. The church lady said it wasn't natural for a 26-year-old widow to take in so many children alone. They said she was collecting them for dark purposes, that grief had twisted her mind. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But what they didn't know was that Alina's heart had room for the unwanted, and her hands were strong enough to build a family from nothing. What they couldn't have predicted was that a man with sun-weathered skin and gentle eyes would see past their cruel whispers and recognize something beautiful in the chaos Alina had embraced. The first child came on a Tuesday morning in March, when the last snow was melting into muddy streams that carved channels down Cedar Falls Main Street. Alina was hanging laundry behind her small wooden house when she heard the soft crying. She followed the sound to her back porch, where a girl of perhaps 7 years sat huddled against the door, her dark hair matted and her dress torn at the shoulder. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Alina asked, crouching down to meet the child's frightened eyes. "Lily," the girl whispered. "Lily Brennan. My mama died of the fever and they put me on the train from Boston. But nobody wanted me at the station. Yesterday," Elena's chest tightened. She knew about the orphan trains that brought children west, promising them homes and families. She also knew that many children were left behind when the selections were made, deemed too old, too sickly, or simply unlucky. "Well, Lily Brennan," Alina said, extending her hand, "would you like some breakfast? I have fresh biscuits and honey." That afternoon, when Mrs. Abernathy from the church committee knocked on Elena's door, she found Lily clean and fed, helping Alina mend a quilt by the fireplace. "Alina, dear," Mrs. Abernathy said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "surely you don't intend to keep this child? A woman in your position, without a husband's guidance, it simply isn't appropriate." "My position?" Alina asked, never looking up from her stitching. "You know what people say about women who live alone and collect strays. It gives the wrong impression." Alina finally raised her eyes, and Mrs. Abernathy took a step back. "At the steel she found there. Let them say what they will. This child needs a home, and I have one to give." Mrs. Abernathy left with her lips pressed into a thin line, and by evening, half the town knew that the Hartwell widow had taken in Anne. Orphan child. The whispers began that very night. 3 weeks later, the second child arrived. This time, it was a boy named Marcus Chun, 12 years old with intelligent eyes and a defiant jaw. His parents had died building the railroad, and he'd been living rough in the mountains, surviving on wild berries and whatever small game he could catch. Sheriff Davidson brought him to Elena's door after finding him stealing bread from Miller's bakery. "He's part Chinese," Sheriff Davidson said, as if this explained everything. "Nobody in town will take him. Figured you might know what to do with him." Marcus stood silent and proud despite his torn clothes and hollow cheeks. Elena saw herself in his stance, the way he held his head high even when the world looked down on him. "Can you read, Marcus?" she asked. The boy nodded once. "Good. Lily's been wanting help with her letters. You'll share the loft room with whoever comes next." Sheriff Davidson raised an eyebrow. "Whoever comes next?" Elena shrugged. "There's always another child who needs a home." She was right. By summer's end, 3 more children had found their way to the small house on Elm Street. There was Samuel Morrison, a 9-year-old redhead whose parents died in a fire, leaving him with burned scars along his left arm that made other families reluctant to take him. Then came the twins, Rose and Ruth Patterson, age 5, who spoke only to each other in a language of whispers and shared glances, trauma having stolen their voices after witnessing their father's violent death. The house that had once seemed spacious for Elena alone now burst with life and noise. She moved her own bedroom to a corner of the main room, giving the children the two proper bedrooms. Marcus and Samuel shared one room, while Lily helped care for the twins in the other. Elena's savings, modest to begin with, dwindled quickly as she stretched to feed and clothe 5 growing children. She took in laundry and sewing, her fingers working by lamplight long after the children were asleep. During the day, she tended a vegetable garden that grew larger each season, teaching the children to plant and harvest alongside her. Marcus proved gifted with numbers and helped her manage the household accounts. Lily showed talent for cooking and took over the kitchen duties with fierce pride. Samuel, despite his scars, had gentle hands perfect for tending to injuries and sickness. The twins, though still largely silent, communicated through art, drawing pictures that covered every available wall space. But as Elena's makeshift family grew stronger, the town's disapproval grew louder. At the general store, conversations stopped when she entered. Children were pulled closer to their mothers when her brood walked past. The preacher, Reverend Whitmore, began delivering sermons about the proper structure of Christian families and the dangers of women operating outside God's intended order. "It's not right," Elena overheard Mrs. Carmichael telling her friend outside the post office. 5 children and no father figure. "Mark my words, those children will grow up wild and godless." "I heard she practices some kind of folk medicine," Mrs. Foster added. "Probably why so many sick children end up at her door. There's something unnatural about it." Elena quickened her pace, hoping the children hadn't heard, but she caught Marcus's jaw tightening and knew he'd absorbed every cruel word. The isolation deepened when winter came, early that year. Elena's woodpile, sufficient for 1 person, proved inadequate for 6. The children took turns keeping the fire burning through the night, and more than once Elena found them huddled together for warmth in the morning. She sold her wedding ring to buy coal, telling the children it had been lost in the garden. Food became scarce as her sewing work decreased during the harsh weather. Elena learned to make meals stretch impossibly far. A single chicken became soup for 3 days, and bread became a luxury rather than a staple. She lost weight rapidly, though she made sure the children never knew they were going without. When Marcus asked why she wasn't eating, she claimed the cooking smells filled her up. It was during this hardest winter that Elena first noticed the man who would change everything, though she didn't realize his significance at the time. She was walking back from town after a failed attempt to secure more work when she saw him loading supplies onto a wagon outside Henderson's store. He was tall and lean, with brown hair touched by early gray at the temples. His clothes were practical, rather than fashionable, well-made but worn, the kind worn by someone who worked with his hands. What struck her most was how he moved with quiet efficiency, never rushing but accomplishing twice what other men managed in the same time. Their eyes met briefly as she passed, and he touched the brim of his hat in a polite nod. Elena nodded back, surprised by the simple courtesy. Most men in town either ignored her entirely or stared with uncomfortable intensity at the young widow living alone. She might have forgotten the encounter entirely, but the next morning she found a cord of seasoned firewood stacked neatly beside her house. No note, no explanation. When she asked her neighbors, they claimed to know nothing about it. The mystery deepened a few days later when she discovered a sack of flour and canned goods on her back porch. "Someone's leaving us food," Lily announced at breakfast, eyes wide with excitement. "Maybe it's angels," Ruth Patterson whispered, the first words Elena had heard her speak in months. Marcus, ever practical, frowned. "Angels don't leave footprints in the snow. Someone real is helping us." Elena studied the tracks leading away from her porch. They were large, definitely made by a man's boots, and they led toward the edge of town before disappearing into the woods. She made a mental note to pay closer attention to who came and went from their quiet street. The mysterious deliveries continued throughout the winter. Sometimes it was food, sometimes fuel for the fire, occasionally warm clothing that fit the children perfectly. Elena began to suspect their benefactor was watching them more closely than she'd initially realized. The clothing donations were too precisely sized to be coincidental, and the timing of food deliveries often coincided with their cupboards reaching dangerous emptiness. Despite the anonymous help, Elena's reputation in town continued to deteriorate. The whispers evolved into open speculation about her moral character and fitness as a guardian. Someone started a rumor that she was accepting money from the children's extended families while claiming to care for them out of charity. Another story suggested she was training the children to steal, using their innocent faces to lower people's guard. The breaking point came in late February, when Reverend Whitmore delivered a sermon that, while never mentioning Elena by name, made his target unmistakably clear. "There are those among us," he intoned from his pulpit, "who collect the vulnerable for their own purposes, who use charity as a mask for darker intentions. The good book tells us that children need both a mother and a father, that a household without proper masculine authority breeds confusion and moral decay." Elena, who had been attending services regularly despite the cold reception, felt every eye in the congregation turned toward her pew. The children, sensing the shift in atmosphere, pressed closer to her sides. Marcus's hand found hers and squeezed tight. "When we see such disorder in our community," the Reverend continued, "it is our Christian duty to speak out, to protect the innocent from those who would exploit their need for love and security." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Elena stood up abruptly, the wooden pew creaking in the sudden silence. With as much dignity as she could muster, she walked out of the church, 5 children following in her wake like devoted soldiers. They never returned to Sunday service, but the damage was done. The social isolation that had been gradually building now became a wall. Shopkeepers served Elena but refused to make conversation. Other mothers pulled their children away when her orphans approached. The town doctor, Dr. Pemberton, began charging her double his usual rates, claiming her large family created extra risk and inconvenience. Elena faced a choice. She could send the children away, perhaps to the state orphanage in the capital, where they'd be separated and likely face harsh conditions, or she could dig in and fight for the family they'd built together. The decision was easier than it should have been. These children weren't just her responsibility, they were her heart, walking around outside her body. "Let them talk," she told Marcus one evening as they sat by the fire, the younger children asleep. "We know who we are, and we know we belong together." Marcus, wise beyond his 12 years, nodded solemnly. "They're afraid of us because we're different, because we found each other when nobody else wanted us." "That's exactly right," Elena said. "And we're going to keep finding each other, no matter what anyone says." What Elena didn't know was that someone else had been watching the drama unfold with growing admiration for her courage and quiet fury at the town's treatment of her family. The mysterious benefactor who had been leaving supplies was about to step out of the shadows, and when he did, everything would change. The man's name was Thomas Bridger, and he owned a cattle ranch 15 miles outside of Cedar Falls. He was 34 years old, had never married, and had been quietly observing Elena Hartwell's situation for months with a mixture of respect and protective instinct he couldn't quite explain. What had started as simple Christian charity, leaving supplies for a struggling family, had evolved into something deeper as he witnessed Elena's unwavering dedication to her children and the town's shameful response to her kindness. Thomas had his own reasons for understanding what it meant to be an outsider. His ranch, while successful, was built on land that had once belonged to a Native American family who'd been forced out during the territorial conflicts of the previous decade. Thomas had purchased the property legitimately, But he'd also quietly sought out the displaced family and arranged to pay them a portion of his profits each year, an arrangement that would have scandalized the town if they'd known about it. He'd been raised by a father who believed in justice over convenience and a mother who taught him that a person's worth was measured by how they treated those who couldn't help them in return. Elena Hartwell, caring for 5 unwanted children while facing the town's scorn, embodied everything his parents had taught him to respect. The morning after Reverend Whitmer's sermon, Thomas made a decision that would change 2 lives forever. He was going to introduce himself properly to Elena Hartwell, and he was going to make sure she knew she wasn't as alone as the town wanted her to believe. Thomas Bridger arrived at Elena's door on a crisp March morning, hat in hand and a nervous energy that seemed at odds with his usual steady demeanor. He'd rehearsed what he would say during the 15-mile ride from his ranch, but standing on her small porch with children's laughter echoing from inside the house, all his prepared words scattered like leaves in the wind, Elena opened the door, expecting to find the postman or perhaps another creditor, but instead faced a stranger whose weathered face held kind eyes and an uncertain smile. She recognized him immediately as the man from outside Henderson's store, though up close she could see details that distance had hidden: the small scar above his left eyebrow, the calluses on his hands that spoke of honest work, the way he held himself with quiet confidence despite his obvious nervousness. "Ma'am," Thomas said, his voice deeper than Elena had expected, "I'm Thomas Bridger. I own the Double Creek Ranch outside town. I was wondering if I might have a word with you." Elena's hand tightened on the doorframe. Few visitors brought good news to her household, and she'd learned to be cautious. "What about, Mr. Bridger?" "About helping," he said simply. "About the supplies that have been finding their way to your porch." Elena's breath caught. She'd suspected. The mysterious deliveries came from someone local, but she hadn't expected the benefactor to reveal himself. "That was you?" Thomas nodded, his hat brim casting shadows across his face. "Yes, ma'am. And I'd like to do more, if you'll let me." Before Elena could respond, Marcus appeared beside her, his protective instincts clearly activated by the presence of an unknown man at their door. Samuel joined him moments later, both boys positioning themselves where they could act if needed. Elena felt a surge of pride at their loyalty, even as she recognized the tragedy that had taught them such vigilance. "Boys, this is Mr. Bridger," Elena said carefully. "Mr. Bridger, these are 2 of my sons, Marcus and Samuel." Thomas noticed how naturally she claimed them as her own, not stepchildren or wards, but simply her sons. It said everything about the kind of woman she was. "Pleased to meet you both," Thomas said, addressing the boys directly rather than speaking over them to Elena. "I've heard good things about how you help your mother." Marcus studied Thomas with the intensity of someone forced to grow up too quickly. "What kind of help are you offering?" Thomas appreciated the boy's directness. "The practical kind. Your wood supply won't last much longer, and spring planting season is coming. I have resources you need, and I suspect you have something I need too." Elena frowned. "What could we possibly have that you need, Mr. Bridger?" "Purpose," Thomas said. Quietly, company. "A reason to use what God gave me for something that matters." The honesty in his voice caught Elena off guard. She'd expected him to offer charity tinged with pity, or worse, charity that came with strings attached. Instead, he spoke as if helping them would somehow help him too. "Why don't you come in?" Elena said, stepping back from the doorway. "We can talk properly." Thomas entered the small house and was immediately struck by how it felt like a home despite its obvious poverty. Lily was teaching the twins to braid each other's hair near the window, their quiet giggles creating a musical backdrop. The walls were covered with the twins' artwork and Marcus's carefully drawn maps of the surrounding area. Samuel's collection of pressed flowers and herbs hung in neat bundles from the rafters. Everything was clean and organized, but more than that, everything spoke of love and attention. Sit, please, Elena said, gesturing toward the table that dominated the main room. Lily, would you make tea for our guest? Yes, Mama, Lily said, the word coming so naturally that Thomas realized these children truly saw Elena as their mother, not their guardian. As they settled around the table, Thomas noticed how the family dynamics played out. Marcus took a position where he could watch both Thomas and the door. Samuel sat close enough to Elena to offer silent support. Lily moved with practiced efficiency, clearly comfortable in her role as the household's helper. The twins remained together but watched Thomas with curious eyes, no longer completely withdrawn as they might have been when they first arrived. Mr. Bridger, Elena began, I'm grateful for your help these past months. More grateful than you. No, but I have to ask, why us? Why now? Thomas considered his answer carefully. He could offer safe explanations about Christian duty or community responsibility, but something about Elena's direct gaze demanded honesty. I lost my parents when I was 16, he said finally. Influenza took them both within a week. I had the ranch, but I was alone with it. The neighbors helped some, but mostly they waited to see if I'd fail so they could buy the land cheap. I know what it's like to have people count you out before you've had a fair chance. Elena nodded slowly. But you didn't fail. No, ma'am. But it took me years to stop feeling like I was proving myself every day. Watching what this town's been doing to you and these children, it brought back memories I thought I'd put to rest. Marcus leaned forward. So you decided to help because you felt sorry for us? No, Thomas said firmly. I decided to help because I respect what you're doing. Building a family from nothing, standing up to people who think they know better than you do about your own life, that takes courage. I admire courage. Elena felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. When was the last time someone had spoken to her with such straightforward respect? What kind of help are you thinking about? She asked. Thomas pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket. I've been thinking about this for weeks. What I'd like to propose is a partnership. My ranch does well, but it's more land than one man needs. There's a section with a good house about 2 miles from my main property, smaller than what I'd need, but perfect for a family like yours. Elena's hands stilled on her teacup. Mr. Bridger, I can't afford to rent property, let alone buy it. Not asking you to. The house is sitting empty, and empty houses deteriorate. You'd be doing me a favor by living in it, keeping it maintained. In exchange, you'd help with some ranch tasks, cooking during branding season, tending to injured animals, that sort of thing. The boys could learn ranching if they're interested, and there'd be proper schooling for all the children. There's a school? Lily asked, her eyes bright with interest. There's a teacher who comes through the ranching district twice a week. Good woman, fair-minded. She's been after me to find more students for her. Elena struggled to process what Thomas was offering. This house on your property, we'd live there alone? Completely. It's far enough from my place that you'd have total privacy, but close enough that I could help if you needed anything. And Elena. He paused, realizing he'd used her first name without permission, but she didn't correct him. The people in that area judge folks by their work, not their circumstances. You wouldn't face the same problems you've had here in town. Samuel, who'd been silent through most of the conversation, finally spoke up. What's the catch? Thomas smiled at the boys. Wariness. Smart question. The catch is that it would mean leaving Cedar Falls, starting over somewhere new. That's scary, even when your current situation isn't ideal. Would we all go together? Rose Patterson asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. All of you. Thomas confirmed. That's the only way it would work. Elena stood abruptly, moving to the window that looked out on the town that had rejected her family. The main street bustled with people who crossed to the other side when they saw her coming, who whispered about her behind their hands. who questioned her fitness to care for children while offering no help themselves. When would we need to decide? She asked without turning around. No rush. Take whatever time you need. The offer stands as long as you need to think about it. Marcus stood too, joining Elena at the window. Mama, what do you think? Elena looked down at the boy who'd appointed himself her protector, then back at the others gathered around the table. Lily was practically vibrating with excitement at the prospect of proper schooling. Samuel was already asking Thomas detailed questions about the kinds of animals on the ranch. The twins sat close together, whispering in their private language. But their body language suggested interest rather than fear. I think, Elena said slowly, that we've been fighting a battle we can't win in a place that doesn't want us. Maybe it's time to find somewhere we can build instead of just survive. Thomas felt his heart rate quicken, but he kept his expression neutral. There's something else you should know. The ranch community, they're not like the people here. In town, they've got their own problems with gossip and judgment, but they respect hard work above everything else. A woman who can raise 5 children and keep them healthy and happy while the whole town works against her. That's the kind of person they'd welcome. Elena turned from the window, studying Thomas's face for any sign of deception or hidden motives. She found neither. What she saw was a man who seemed genuinely invested in her family's well-being, who spoke about her children with the same protective tone she used herself. Could we see the house? She asked, before we decide. Of course, whenever you want. I could come by with a wagon tomorrow if you'd like. Yes, Elena said, surprising herself with the firmness of her decision. We'd like that very much. After Thomas left, the small house buzzed with excitement and nervous energy. Marcus immediately began calculating what they could afford to take with them and what they'd have to leave behind. Lily started making lists of questions about the school and the teacher. Samuel peppered Elena with worries about whether they could trust Thomas's offer. The twins, in their quiet way, began gathering their favorite drawings and small treasures. Elena spent the evening after the children were asleep thinking about Thomas Bridger and his unexpected proposal. There was something about him that felt safe in a way she hadn't experienced since her husband's death. Not safe in the sense of being rescued. She'd learned to rescue herself, but safe in the sense of being understood and accepted. She thought about his hands, scarred from honest work, and the way he'd spoken directly to the children instead of treating them as burdens to be tolerated. She remembered how he'd called her by her first name without making it sound presumptuous, how he'd described her situation with respect rather than pity. But more than anything, she thought about his eyes when he'd looked around her makeshift home and seen not poverty but family. When he'd watched her children and seen not charity cases but individuals worth knowing. When he'd looked at her and seen not a fallen woman or a figure of suspicion, but someone whose choices he admired. The next morning brought a surprise visitor that reminded Elena exactly why Thomas's offer was so appealing. Mrs. Abernathy arrived with 2 other church committee members, their faces set in expressions of grim determination. Elena, Mrs. Abernathy began without preamble, we need to discuss your situation. My situation is fine, thank you, Elena replied, not inviting them in. That's exactly what we need to address. Your situation is not fine, and it's affecting the moral climate of our entire community. These children need proper homes with proper families. Mrs. Morrison, whose husband owned the largest store in town, stepped forward. We've been in contact with the territorial authority. There are proper institutions that can care for these children, places where they'll learn discipline and useful trades. Elena's blood turned to ice. You want to take my children away? They're not your children, Elena. They're orphans who need more structure than a single woman can provide. We're offering to help arrange proper placements. Marcus appeared beside Elena, his young face hard with fury. We don't want other placements. This is our home. Mrs. Abernathy barely glanced at him. Children don't always know what's best for them. That's why God provides adult guidance. Like the adult guidance that left these children on orphan trains? Elena asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Like the adult guidance that turned away from them when they needed homes? Elena, be reasonable. You can barely feed them. You have no male authority in the household, and frankly, your reputation in this town makes it impossible for these children to have normal social development. Elena stepped forward, and something in her movement made all three women take a step back. Get off my property, now. Elena, now. And if you come back here threatening my family, you'll discover just how unreasonable I can be. The women, left in a flutter of indignation and muttered threats about involving higher authorities. Elena closed the door and leaned against it, her heart pounding. Mama, Lily's voice was small and scared. They can't really take us away, can they? Elena gathered all 5 children around her, holding them as tightly as she could. Not if I have anything to say about it. But children, we might need to make some changes sooner than we planned. When Thomas arrived with his wagon that afternoon, he found a family ready for something more than just a visit to look at a house. They were ready for a completely new beginning, and they were ready to trust him to help them find it. Elena climbed onto the wagon seat beside Thomas. The 5 children settled in the back with their few precious possessions, and for the first time in months, she felt hope instead of just determination. The future was uncertain, but it was theirs to shape. As the wagon rolled away from Cedar Falls and toward the open country where Thomas's ranch waited, Elena didn't look back once, neither did the children. They were done with the past and ready to discover what came next. The house Thomas had promised stood like a beacon of possibility against the rolling hills of his ranch land. Built from honey-colored logs with a wide front porch and real glass windows, it was modest but solid, surrounded by wildflowers that had claimed the yard during its months of emptiness. Elena had never lived anywhere so beautiful, and judging by the children's awed silence as the wagon approached, neither had they. It's got 4 bedrooms, Thomas said, his voice carefully neutral despite his obvious pride in the property. Kitchens. Got a good stove, and there's a root cellar that stays cool year-round. Well, water's sweet, and the chimney draws clean. Lily was the first to break the spell, scrambling down from the wagon before it had fully stopped. Look, Mama. There's a swing. Indeed, a wooden swing hung from the massive oak tree that shaded the front yard, its ropes weathered but strong. Elena wondered who had built it and for whom, but Thomas's expression suggested the story behind it was his to tell when he was ready. Samuel helped the twins down while Marcus surveyed the property with his characteristic thoroughness. How far to your main house? He asked Thomas. About 2 miles that way. Thomas pointed northwest, where smoke rose from a distant chimney. Close enough if you need help, far enough that you'll have complete privacy. Elena climbed down from the wagon seat, her legs unsteady from more than just the long ride. The magnitude of what was happening, leaving everything familiar, trusting a man she barely knew, starting over in a place where she'd have to prove herself all over again, hit her with sudden force. Thomas noticed her hesitation. Would you like to see inside? The interior was even better than the exterior had promised. Sunlight streamed through clean windows onto wooden floors that gleamed with recent polishing. The main room was spacious enough for the whole family to gather comfortably, with a stone fireplace that would keep them warm through the hardest winters. The kitchen boasted a cast-iron stove that was newer and larger than anything Elena had ever cooked on. Mr. Bridger, she said softly, this is far too generous. We can't possibly accept, Elena. Thomas's use of her first name stopped her mid-sentence. I told you yesterday, this helps me too. This house was built for a family, and it's been empty too long. Houses need people to keep them alive. The children had scattered to explore, their excited voices echoing from different rooms. Alina could hear Lily exclaiming over built-in shelves in what would clearly become her room, while Samuel discovered a window that looked out over a meadow where wildflowers grew in abundance. The twins had found each other in the largest bedroom, and were already planning how to arrange their shared space. Marcus returned to the main room, his expression serious. "It's perfect," he told Alina quietly, "almost too perfect. Are you sure about this?" Elena appreciated his caution, even as it reminded her how much these children had already learned about disappointment. "I'm sure we can't stay in Cedar Falls," she said. "Beyond that, we'll figure it out as we go." Thomas had been examining the stove, but Elena caught him listening to their conversation. When their eyes met, he offered a small smile that somehow conveyed both understanding and patience. "There's something else I should show you," he said. "The reason I think this arrangement will work better than you might expect." He led them outside and around to the back of the house, where a large vegetable garden lay dormant but well maintained. Beyond it stretched a fenced pasture where several horses grazed peacefully. "Those are mine," Thomas said, "but they're gentler animals, good for learning. I thought the children might enjoy working with them. Horses are honest creatures. They don't care about your history, only how you treat them in the present moment." Samuel's eyes lit up with interest, and Elena remembered his gentle way with injured creatures. Even the twins seemed drawn to the peaceful animals, though they maintained their cautious distance. "The garden's yours to use however you want," Thomas continued. "Soil's rich, and there's a stream that runs just beyond those trees for irrigation. You could grow enough food to feed yourselves and have extra for trading or selling." Elena walked to the garden's edge, kneeling to crumble the dark soil between her fingers. It was indeed rich, the kind of earth that would reward hard work with abundant harvests. She could already envision rows of vegetables, herb patches near the kitchen door, maybe even fruit trees if they stayed long enough to see them mature. The thought stopped her cold. If they stayed long enough. Was she already thinking of this as permanent? After just one day of knowing Thomas Bridger properly, Mrs. Hartwell? The voice belonged to a woman Elena hadn't noticed approaching. She was perhaps 40 years old, with graying brown hair pulled back practically and clothes that spoke of sensible prosperity rather than wealth. "I'm Catherine Mills. I teach the children in this district." Elena rose, brushing soil from her hands. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Mills." "Mrs. Mills, actually. I'm widowed too." The woman's smile was warm and genuine. "Thomas sent word yesterday that you might be joining our community. I wanted to introduce myself and let you know how pleased I'd be to have your children in my classes." "All of them?" Elena asked, surprised. In Cedar Falls, the twins' selective mutism and Marcus's mixed heritage had made school attendance complicated. "All of them," Mrs. Mills confirmed. "I've taught children who faced every kind of hardship. What matters to me is their willingness to learn, not their past circumstances." Lily appeared at Elena's elbow, drawn by the mention of school. "What subjects do you teach, ma'am?" "Reading, writing, arithmetic, natural sciences, and geography. Also music and art when time permits." "What's your favorite subject, dear?" "Reading," Lily said immediately. "I help teach the little ones their letters, but I'd love to read harder books myself." Double quotes. Mrs. Mills nodded approvingly. "I have several students who started as teachers for their younger siblings. It shows responsibility and natural aptitude." As the two women talked, Elena noticed Thomas had moved to the pasture fence, where Marcus was cautiously approaching one of the horses. The animal, a gentle-looking mare with a graying muzzle, stood perfectly still as the boy extended his hand. "That's Dulcie," Thomas called softly. "She's 20 years old and has more patience than most people. Raised 3 generations of foals and taught twice as many children to ride." Marcus stroked the mare's neck with wonder. Elena had never seen him so immediately trusting of anything or anyone, but somehow Thomas's quiet presence and the horse's gentle nature had bypassed all his usual defenses. Samuel joined his older brother at the fence, followed more cautiously by the twins. Soon all 4 children were gathered around Dulcie, their faces bright with fascination as Thomas explained how to approach horses safely and read their body language. "He's good with them," Mrs. Mills observed quietly. "The children, I mean. Not everyone has that natural understanding." Elena nodded, watching Thomas crouch down to the twins' level as he showed them how to offer treats to the horse with flat palms. "He seems to understand what they need." "Thomas Bridger is one of the finest men in this county," Mrs. Mills said. "Lost his parents young and built that ranch from nothing through sheer determination. Never married, though not for lack of interested women. I think he was waiting for the right situation." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Mrs. Mills, I should clarify, Mr. Bridger is offering us housing and work, nothing more. We're not. That is, there's no understanding between us of a personal nature." Mrs. Mills smiled knowingly. "Of course not. Far too soon for such considerations. I'm simply saying that if such considerations were to arise naturally over time, you couldn't ask for a better man." That evening, after they'd returned to Cedar Falls to pack their belongings, Elena sat with the children around their familiar table one last time. The contrast between the cramped, dim space they were leaving and the bright, spacious house they'd seen that day couldn't have been starker. "Are we making the right choice?" she asked them honestly. "It's not too late to change our minds." "Mama," Lily said firmly, "we've never had a real home before. Just places we were staying until something better came along. That house feels like it could be home." Marcus nodded agreement. "And Mrs. Mills seems like a real teacher, not someone who's just tolerating us until we cause problems." Samuel, who'd been uncharacteristically quiet since their return, finally spoke up. "I liked how the horses looked at us, like we were interesting instead of worrying." The twins, as usual, communicated through their shared glances and small gestures, but their body language suggested excitement rather than anxiety about the change. "Then we're decided," Elena said. "We leave tomorrow." They worked through the night, packing their few possessions and preparing for the move. Elena found herself discarding more than she kept: worn clothes that wouldn't survive another winter, broken furniture that wasn't worth transporting, household items that had served their purpose but weren't needed in their new life. What she kept were the things that mattered: family photographs, the children's artwork and treasures, books that had been read so many times their spines were cracked, the quilt she'd been making from scraps of the children's outgrown clothes. These items fit easily into 2 traveling trunks and several cloth bags. As dawn broke over Cedar Falls, Thomas arrived with his wagon as promised. This time, Elena was ready. She'd left a note for the landlord with 2 weeks' rent money she could barely afford, but felt honor-bound to pay. She'd settled her few remaining debts and said goodbye to the 2 neighbors who'd shown her kindness during her time there. The children climbed into the wagon with eager anticipation rather than the fearful uncertainty that had marked their previous departures from homes that hadn't worked out. This felt different, Elena realized. This felt like moving toward something rather than running away. As the wagon rolled through the awakening town, they passed the church where Reverend Whitmore had delivered his condemnation. They passed the school that had never quite welcomed her children. They passed the homes of families who'd closed their doors and hearts to a struggling widow and her makeshift family. Elena felt no bitterness as they left it all behind. She'd learned what she needed to learn in Cedar Falls: that she was stronger than she'd known, that her children were resilient and loyal, and that sometimes the place you think is home is really just the place that teaches you what home should feel like. The sun climbed higher as they traveled toward the ranch, painting the landscape in shades of gold and green that promised new beginnings. Elena sat beside Thomas on the wagon seat, acutely aware of his steady presence and the way he handled both the horses and her family's transition with equal care. "Thomas," she said quietly, using his first name for the first time, "I want you to know that whatever happens, I'm grateful for this chance." He glanced at her, and she saw something in his expression that made her pulse quicken. It wasn't pity or charity or even simple kindness. It was something warmer and more personal, something that suggested Mrs. Mills might have been right about his reasons for helping them. "Elena," he said, his voice rough with emotion he was trying to keep controlled, "I have a feeling this is going to be good for both of us." Behind them, the children's laughter mixed with the sound of wagon wheels and horse hooves, creating a melody of hope that followed them all the way to their new home. For the first time since her husband's death, Elena allowed herself to believe that the future might hold not just survival, but happiness. Spring transformed the ranch into something magical as Elena and the children settled into rhythms they'd never imagined possible. Within a month, their new house hummed with purposeful activity from dawn until dusk. Marcus had appointed himself chief caretaker of the horses, rising before sunrise to feed and water them with a dedication that surprised even Elena. Samuel had discovered a natural talent for plant medicine, creating an herb garden that Mrs. Mills declared the finest she'd ever seen. Lily threw herself into her studies with such enthusiasm that she finished her grade-level books within weeks and begged for more challenging material. The twins, Rose and Ruth, experienced the most remarkable transformation. Away from the suspicious stares and whispered comments of Cedar Falls, they began to speak more freely, their voices growing stronger each day. They'd claimed the barn loft as their private art studio, covering every surface with drawings that captured the beauty they saw in their new world. Wildflowers dancing in meadow grass, horses grazing under endless sky. Their family gathered around the kitchen table in warm lamplight. Elena found herself thriving in ways she hadn't expected. The garden responded to her touch like it had been waiting for her, specifically producing vegetables so abundant that she began trading surplus with neighboring families. The physical work felt good after months of worry and confinement, and she discovered muscles she'd forgotten she had as she hauled water, tended plants, and helped with various ranch tasks. Thomas visited regularly, always with practical purposes, checking on fence repairs, delivering supplies, coordinating work schedules during busy seasons. But Elena began to notice the way his visits often stretched longer than necessary, how he found reasons to stay for meals, how his eyes followed her movements with growing interest that had nothing to do with their business arrangement. The attraction wasn't one-sided. Elena caught herself looking forward to his appearances with an anticipation that went beyond gratitude or friendship. She noticed the way his shirt stretched across his shoulders when he lifted heavy objects, the careful gentleness of his hands when he worked with injured animals, the quiet authority in his voice when he settled disputes among his ranch hands. Most of all, she noticed how he treated her children not as obligations to be tolerated, but as individuals worthy of his time and attention. The first real test of their new life came in late May, when Elena received an unexpected visitor. She was hanging laundry when a familiar figure rode up the path to their house, Sheriff Davidson from Cedar Falls, his expression grim and official. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, dismounting heavily, "I need to speak with you about the children." Elena's blood turned cold, but she kept her voice steady. "What about them, Sheriff?" "The church committee filed a formal complaint with the territorial authority. They're claiming you're unfit to care for these children, that you've taken them out of the jurisdiction improperly. There's going to be an investigation." Marcus appeared at Lena's shoulder, his young face hard with protective fury. "An investigation into what?" Sheriff Davidson shifted uncomfortably. "Into whether Mrs. Hartwell can provide adequate care and moral guidance for 5 orphan children without proper community oversight." "You mean without the church committee's oversight?" Elena said quietly. "Mrs. Hartwell, I'm not here as their representative." I'm here because I'm required by law to inform you that an official from the territorial office will be visiting within the next 2 weeks to assess the situation. Elena felt the world tilt slightly. Just when they'd found stability, just when the children were thriving, the past was reaching out to drag them back into uncertainty. What exactly will this official be assessing? She asked. Living conditions, educational provisions, moral environment, financial stability. Whether the children are better served by your current arrangement or by placement in approved institutions. Samuel and Lily had emerged from the house, drawn by the serious tone of conversation. The twins appeared in the garden, their faces clouded with the wariness that had taken months to fade. "Sheriff," Marcus said with dignity beyond his 12 years. "We don't want to be in institutions. This is our family." Sheriff Davidson's expression softened slightly. "Son, I can see you're happy here. But the law doesn't always account for what children want. It accounts for what officials think children need." After the sheriff left, Elena gathered her family around the kitchen table. The fear in their faces broke her heart, but she knew honesty was the only way forward. "We're going to face this together," she said firmly. "We've built something real here, something good. We're not going to let people who don't know us or understand us tear it apart." "But what if they decide we have to go anyway?" Lily asked, her voice small. "Then we'll figure out our next step when that happens. But we're not giving up without fighting for what we've built." That evening, Thomas arrived for what Elena had thought would be a routine check on the property. Instead, she found herself telling him about Sheriff Davidson's visit and the upcoming investigation. Thomas listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious with each detail. "Those interfering busybodies," he said finally, his usual calm cracking to reveal the anger beneath. "They couldn't stand seeing you succeed, so they're trying to destroy what you've built." Elena was surprised by the intensity of his reaction. "Thomas, this isn't your fight. You've already done more than enough by giving us this chance." "Like hell it isn't my fight." Thomas stood abruptly, pacing to the window that looked out over the peaceful evening landscape. "Elena, these children ... this family. You've all become important to me. More important than I probably should admit." Something in his voice made Elena's pulse quicken. "What do you mean?" Thomas turned back to face her, and the look in his eyes was so intense it took her breath away. "I mean that somewhere along the way, helping you stopped being about charity and started being about love. I love watching Marcus gain confidence with the horses. I love seeing Samuel's pride in his garden. I love hearing the twins laugh. I love seeing Lily discover how smart she is." He paused, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. "And I love seeing you become the woman you were meant to be, free from people who couldn't see your worth." Elena felt tears stinging her eyes. "Thomas, I know it's too soon. I know you're not ready to think about such things, and I don't want to complicate an already difficult situation. But Elena, I need you to know that you're not facing this alone. Whatever that official finds, whatever they decide, you have someone in your corner who will fight for you and these children with everything he has." The next morning brought a surprise that shifted Elena's perspective on their situation entirely. Mrs. Mills arrived with a woman Elena had never met, a well-dressed lady in her 50s with intelligent eyes and an air of quiet authority. "Elena," Mrs. Mills said, "I'd like you to meet Margaret Thornton. She's the territorial supervisor who will be conducting your evaluation." Elena's heart nearly stopped. The investigation was happening now, without warning, and she wasn't prepared. Mrs. Thornton stepped forward with a warm smile that immediately contradicted Elena's expectations. "Mrs. Hartwell, I apologize for the surprise visit, but I find these evaluations work better when families aren't spending weeks preparing to show me what they think I want to see. I prefer to see how you actually live." "Of course," Elena said, trying to calm her racing heart. Would you like to come in? The children are doing their morning chores, but I can call them. Actually, I'd prefer to observe them naturally first. If you don't mind. Mrs. Mills has been telling me remarkable things about your family's adaptation to life here. For the next 2 hours, Mrs. Thornton watched the family's daily routine with keen but kind attention. She observed Marcus working with the horses, noting his confident handling of animals that required trust and responsibility. She watched Samuel, in his herb garden, asking knowledgeable questions about plant identification and medicinal uses that demonstrated real learning. She spent time with Lily as the girl helped prepare lunch, testing her reading skills and mathematical knowledge in casual conversation. When the twins showed her their art studio in the barn loft, Mrs. Thornton's professional demeanor cracked. Slightly. "These are extraordinary," she murmured, studying their detailed drawings. The emotional growth represented in this progression. It's remarkable. But it was the family's interaction during lunch that seemed to make the strongest impression. Mrs. Thornton watched how naturally they worked together, how respectfully they treated each other, how Alina guided them with gentle authority rather than harsh discipline. She noticed how the children looked to Alina not with fear or calculation, but with genuine affection and trust. "Mrs. Hartwell," Mrs. Thornton said as they sat on the front porch while the children returned to their activities, "I've reviewed the complaints filed against you. They paint a picture of an unstable woman collecting children for questionable purposes, providing inadequate care and moral guidance." Elena's hands clenched in her lap. "And what do you see here?" "I see 5 children who are thriving in ways that frankly surprise me. I see educational progress that exceeds what most children achieve in traditional schools. I see emotional healing that speaks to exceptional care and patience. Most importantly, I see a family." Mrs. Thornton opened her official folder and made several notes. "I also see something else that the complainants failed to mention in their accusations." "What's that?" "A community that supports and values this family. Mrs. Mills speaks of your children with the same pride she shows for her own students. Your neighbors describe you as hardworking and reliable, Mr. Bridger." She paused, a slight smile playing at her lips. "Mr. Bridger becomes quite passionate when discussing your situation. He used words like remarkable and admirable, and made it very clear that any attempt to disrupt this family would meet with strong opposition from him personally." Elena felt warmth spread through her chest. Thomas had already been fighting for them, even before she'd known the battle was coming. "Mrs. Hartwell, my recommendation will be that these children remain in your care permanently. Furthermore, I'm going to suggest that the territorial office formally recognize your guardianship, which will make it much more difficult for outside parties to challenge your authority in the future." Elena could barely believe what she was hearing. "You're saying we can stay together?" "I'm saying you've created something remarkable here, and it would be criminal to destroy it based on the narrow-minded prejudices of people who clearly don't understand what constitutes a healthy family." That evening, after Mrs. Thornton had left with her positive evaluation complete, Elena found herself alone on the front porch as the children played in the yard. The weight of constant worry that she'd carried for months had lifted, leaving her feeling almost dizzy with relief. Doc Thomas appeared on the path as the sun was setting, riding toward the house with an urgency that suggested he'd heard about the day's events. He dismounted while his horse was still moving and strode toward the porch with an expression of barely controlled anxiety. "Elena, how did it go?" She stood to meet him, and something in her face must have conveyed the good news, because his worried expression immediately transformed into relief and joy. "We're staying together," she said simply. "All of us. Permanently." Thomas swept her into his arms before either of them realized what was happening, spinning her around the porch while she laughed with pure happiness. When he set her down, they were standing close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Elena, he said softly, his hand still resting on her waist. "I have something I need to tell you." She looked up at him, her heart pounding for entirely new reasons. "What is it?" "I love you. Not just your children, not just what you represent, but you. I love your strength and your kindness and your fierce protection of your family. I love the way you make this place feel like home just by being in it." Elena felt tears streaming down her face, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "Thomas, I love you too. I have for weeks, but I was afraid to admit it, afraid it would complicate everything. And now?" She reached up to touch his face, feeling the roughness of his day's beard against her palm. "Now I think maybe love doesn't complicate things. Maybe it makes everything simpler." When Thomas kissed her, soft and careful and full of promise, Elena felt the last pieces of her broken life clicking into place. She was no longer the outcast widow struggling alone. She was a woman who'd found her home and her heart's desire in the same place, surrounded by children who were truly hers and a man who saw her exactly as she was and loved her for it. The children cheered from the yard, having witnessed the entire exchange, and Elena realized that they'd all been waiting for this moment, hoping for it even when she'd been too scared to hope for herself. 6 months after Thomas's declaration of love, Elena woke to the sound of hammering echoing across the ranch property. Through her bedroom window, she could see him working with Marcus and Samuel, constructing what appeared to be an addition to the main barn. The project had been going on for weeks, always when she was busy with other tasks, always with hushed conversations that stopped when she approached. "They're planning something," Lily confided as she helped Elena prepare breakfast. "Papa Thomas swore all of us to secrecy, but I think you're going to like it." Elena's heart still skipped when the children called Thomas Papa. It had started naturally, without discussion or formal decision. One day Rose had referred to Papa Thomas and Mama Elena while talking to Mrs. Mills, and the name had stuck. Thomas had been so moved the first time he heard it that he'd had to excuse himself to the barn for several minutes to compose himself. The official adoption papers had been filed 3 months earlier, making Elena's guardianship of the 5 children legally permanent and unassailable. But more significantly, Thomas had formally asked Elena to marry him on a warm September evening, presenting her with a ring he'd had made by the territorial capital's finest jeweler, a simple gold band set with 5 small stones, one for each child, surrounding a larger diamond that represented their family's central love. Elena had said yes. Before he'd finished asking the question, the wedding was planned for December, giving them time to prepare properly and allowing Elena to design and sew a dress worthy of the occasion. Mrs. Mills had volunteered to help coordinate the celebration, and neighboring families had offered everything from music to flowers to food. Even the minister who would perform the ceremony, Pastor Williams from the next county over, had made a special trip to meet the family and pronounce them a testament to God's grace working through human love. But this morning's secretive construction project seemed to involve something beyond wedding preparations. Elena had learned to read Thomas's expressions well enough to know when he was excited about a surprise, and lately he'd worn that look almost constantly. "Mama Elena," Ruth called from the front porch. "Someone's coming up the road." Elena looked out to see a familiar wagon approaching, driven by Mrs. Mills but carrying passengers she didn't recognize. As the wagon drew closer, she could make out an elderly woman with silver hair and a man about Thomas's age, who bore a strong resemblance to him around the eyes and jawline. Thomas emerged from the barn, wiping sawdust from his hands, his face breaking into a broad grin when he saw the wagon's occupants. He strode toward them with obvious joy, and Elena realized these must be people important to him, people he'd been anticipating. "Elena," he called, gesturing for her to join him. "Come meet my family." Family, in all their months together. Thomas had rarely mentioned relatives, and Elena had assumed he was as alone in the world as she'd been. But as the elderly woman climbed down from the wagon with Thomas's assistance, The resemblance was unmistakable. "Elena, this is my grandmother, Catherine Bridger, and my cousin James, who manages the family ranch in Colorado." "Grandmother, James, this is Elena, and these are our children." Catherine Bridger was a small woman with keen blue eyes and the kind of straight posture that spoke of inner strength. She studied Elena with frank assessment, then surprised her by stepping forward and taking her hands. "Thomas has written extensively about you and the children," she said, her voice carrying traces of an accent Elena couldn't place. "He described a remarkable woman who'd built a family from love rather than blood. I can see he didn't exaggerate." James Bridger was quieter than his grandmother, but his handshake was firm and his smile genuine. "Thomas asked us to come for the wedding, but he also had another purpose in mind." Elena glanced at Thomas questioningly, but he was gathering the children around them with barely contained excitement. "Grandmother," he said formally, "I'd like you to meet Marcus, Samuel, Lily, Rose, and Ruth. Children, this is my grandmother, who raised me after my parents died, and my cousin James." The children responded with the polite manners Elena had taught them, but she could see their curiosity about these unexpected relatives. Catherine Bridger seemed equally fascinated by them, asking each child about their interests and activities with genuine attention. "Marcus, Thomas tells me you have a special talent with horses," she said. "Would you show me this afternoon?" "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied, standing straighter with pride. "I've been working with a young stallion that was considered untrainable. Papa Thomas says I have gentle hands. And Samuel, I understand you've created quite an impressive medicinal garden. In my day, every ranch needed someone who understood healing plants. It's a valuable skill." Samuel beamed under her attention. "Would you like to see it, Mrs. Bridger? I've been experimenting with different drying techniques to preserve the herbs through winter." As the children chattered with their new family members, Thomas drew Elena aside. "I have something to show you," he said quietly. "The reason I asked them to come now, before the wedding." He led her toward the mysterious barn addition, which Elena could now see was nearly complete. The new structure connected to the existing barn but had windows and a door that suggested it was intended for human occupancy rather than animals. "Thomas, what is this?" "Your wedding gift," he said simply, opening the door to reveal a space that took Elena's breath away. The room was set up as a workshop, with long tables for cutting fabric, shelves for storing materials, and a beautiful new sewing machine positioned near the largest window. Bolts of fine fabric in every color imaginable lined one wall, while another displayed an array of sewing notions, threads, and tools that represented a fortune in supplies. "I know you've been taking in sewing work to help with expenses," Thomas said, watching her face carefully. "But I also know you love creating beautiful things, and you're extraordinarily talented at it. This is your space where you can work on whatever projects bring you joy, whether that's our family's clothing, or commissions from other families, or just things you want to make for the pleasure of creating them." Elena walked slowly around the room, touching the smooth work surfaces, admiring the quality of the fabrics, trying to absorb the magnitude of what he'd created for her. "The sewing machine came from San Francisco," Thomas continued. "Grandmother helped me select it. She was quite the seamstress in her day. And James brought some of the specialty fabrics from Denver. We wanted to make sure you had everything you might need." Elena turned to face him, tears streaming down her face. "Thomas, this is too much. I don't deserve. Stop." He crossed to her in 2 quick strides, taking her face in his hands. "Elena Hartwell, you deserve everything beautiful this world has to offer. You deserve space to create and time to pursue what brings you happiness. You deserve to be supported and celebrated and loved exactly as you are. But the expense is an investment in our future happiness. Elena, I want to spend the rest of my life giving you reasons to smile the way you're smiling right now." That afternoon, the extended family gathered to watch Marcus work with the young stallion Thomas had mentioned. The horse, a beautiful bay with intelligent eyes and a spirited disposition, had indeed been considered unmanageable by his previous owner. But under Marcus's patient guidance, the animal was learning to accept bridle and saddle with minimal resistance. "Remarkable," Catherine Bridger murmured as Marcus led the horse through a series of exercises. "The boy has an intuitive understanding of animal psychology. That's not something that can be taught, it's a gift." James nodded agreement. "We have a position opening at our Colorado ranch for someone with those skills. When Marcus is older, if he's interested, there would be good work waiting for him." Elena felt a flutter of anxiety at the thought of any of her children leaving, but she recognized it as the natural progression of a mother watching her children grow toward independence. Marcus was only 13, but someday he would need to make his own way in the world. Knowing he had family who would support his talents and ambitions was a gift she couldn't have imagined a year ago. Samuel's garden tour was equally impressive. He'd not only grown an extensive variety of medicinal herbs, but had also created detailed journals documenting their properties, growing requirements, and preparation methods. Catherine Bridger examined his work with the eye of someone who understood its value. "This level of organization and scientific observation suggests a mind suited for formal medical training," she told Elena quietly. "There are medical colleges now that would welcome a young man with this foundation of knowledge." Elena's heart swelled with pride and possibility. In Cedar Falls, Samuel's mixed heritage and orphan status would have limited his opportunities severely. Here, surrounded by people who valued ability over background, he could aspire to anything his talents would support. Lily's demonstration involved reading aloud from one of Mrs. Mills's advanced texts, then discussing the material with sophisticated understanding that impressed both visitors. Rose and Ruth showed their art collection, which had evolved from simple drawings to complex compositions that told stories without words. "These children are thriving in ways that speak to exceptional care and guidance," Catherine Bridger told Elena as they prepared dinner together. "Thomas chose well when he chose you." "I think we chose each other," Elena replied. "Thomas saw what we needed and had the generosity to provide it. But we've given him something too, a family, a purpose, people to love and protect." "Indeed. I've never seen him so happy, so settled in his own skin. For years I worried that he was too solitary, too focused on work and responsibility. But watching him with you and the children today, I see a man who's found his proper place in the world." That evening, after the children were asleep and James had retired to the guest room Thomas had prepared for him, Elena found herself alone on the front porch with Catherine Bridger. The older woman had requested this private conversation, and Elena was curious about her intentions. "Elena, I want to give you something," Catherine began, reaching into her reticule to withdraw a small jewelry box. "This belonged to Thomas's mother, my daughter Sarah. She died when Thomas was 16, but before that, she made me promise to save this for the woman who would someday become his wife." Elena opened the box to reveal a delicate necklace of silver and pearls, clearly handmade with exquisite skill. Sarah was an accomplished jeweler before she married Thomas's father. She created this piece during her engagement, designing it to be worn by the women in our family on their wedding days. She wore it, I wore it, and now it's yours. Elena lifted the necklace from its box, marveling at the intricate workmanship. Each pearl was perfectly matched, each silver link crafted with precision and care. "Mrs. Bridger, this is a precious family heirloom. Are you certain you want me to have it?" "My dear, you are family now. More than that, you're the answer to prayers I've been offering for Thomas's happiness since he was a lonely 16-year-old boy, trying to manage a ranch and his grief all by himself." Catherine leaned forward, her expression serious but kind. "I've lived long enough to recognize genuine love when I see it. What you and Thomas have built together, what you've created with these children, it's rare and precious. This necklace has been waiting 20 years for the right woman to wear it. I'm grateful it won't have to wait any longer." The wedding took place on a clear December morning with snow dusting the mountains, but sunshine warming the ranch valley. Alina wore a dress she'd created in her new workshop, deep blue silk, with intricate beadwork that caught the light with every movement. The pearl necklace from Thomas's mother completed the ensemble perfectly. The ceremony was held in the newly expanded barn, which had been transformed with evergreen boughs, white ribbons, and candles that cast warm light over the assembled community. Nearly 30 families had come to celebrate, representing the network of neighbors and friends who'd welcomed Elena's family with open arms. Mrs. Mills played piano while Lily sang a song she'd written especially for the occasion. Marcus and Samuel served as groomsmen, their faces solemn with the importance of their roles. Rose and Ruth scattered flower petals from Elena's garden along the makeshift aisle, their identical dresses sewn from fabric left over from Elena's wedding gown. When Pastor Williams asked if anyone objected to the union, the silence was complete and supportive. When Thomas promised to love and cherish Elena and her children for the rest of his life, his voice was strong and sure. When Elena promised to stand beside him through whatever joys and challenges their future might hold, she meant every word with her whole heart. But the moment that brought tears to every eye was when Pastor Williams asked the children to step forward. "Marcus, Samuel, Lily, Rose, and Ruth," he said formally, "do you accept Thomas Bridger as your father, and do you promise to honor and respect him as the head of your family?" "We do," they chorused, their voices ringing clearly through the barn. "And, Thomas Bridger, do you accept these children as your own sons and daughters, promising to guide, protect, and love them as any father would?" "I do," Thomas replied, his voice thick with emotion, "with all my heart." The kiss that sealed their marriage was tender and full of promise, but it was the group embrace that followed, Thomas and Elena surrounded by 5 children who were no longer orphans but beloved sons and daughters, that captured the true meaning of the day. As the celebration continued into the evening with dancing, music, and abundant food, Elena found quiet moments to reflect on the journey that had brought them all to this point. A year ago, she'd been a struggling widow facing the loss of her makeshift family to social prejudice and legal threats. Tonight, she was a cherished wife, a confident mother, and a valued member of a community that saw her family as a blessing rather than a burden. Thomas found her during one of these reflective moments, drawing her into his arms for a dance as their children played with their new cousins and neighbors. Families swirled around them in celebration. "Happy?" he asked, his breath warm against her ear. "Beyond anything I ever dared to dream," Elena replied honestly. "Thomas, how did you know? How did you see what we could become when everyone else saw only problems?" "Because I recognized myself in you," he said simply. "Someone who'd been knocked down by life but refused to stay down. Someone who understood that family isn't about blood. It's about choice and commitment and love that doesn't quit." He spun her gently, her blue silk dress swirling around them as the barn full of friends and family watched with approval and joy. "Besides," Thomas added with a grin that made him look years younger, "I've always been drawn to lost causes and impossible dreams. Lucky for me, you turned out to be neither." Elena laughed, the sound carrying clearly through the barn and mixing with the music and conversation and laughter of a community, celebrating love's triumph over adversity. As midnight approached and the celebration began to wind down, Elena stood with Thomas on their front porch, watching their guests depart with promises to visit soon and expressions of joy for the family's happiness. The 5 children had been tucked into their beds hours earlier, exhausted but glowing with the satisfaction of a perfect day. "Thomas," Elena said quietly, "I have something to tell you." "What's that, Mrs. Bridger?" The name still sent shivers. of happiness through her. I'm expecting a baby. Thomas went very still, then slowly turned to face her, his eyes wide with wonder and joy. A baby? Our baby? Our baby, Alina confirmed, placing his hand on her still flat stomach. Due in summer, according to Dr. Harrison's calculations. Thomas swept her into his arms, spinning her around the porch just as he had on that first evening, when they'd admitted their love for each other. "Elena," he said when he set her down, his voice rough with emotion, "I thought I couldn't possibly be any happier than I was this morning. I was wrong. So our family will grow from 7 to 8. Elena said with satisfaction. "I think we can handle one more. With you as their mother and these 5 as older siblings," Thomas laughed. "That baby will be the luckiest child in the territory." As they stood together in the moonlight, surrounded by the evidence of their shared life, the house they'd made into a home, the land they'd worked together, the barn where they'd just celebrated their marriage, the workshop where Elena would create beautiful things, the pastures where their children would continue to grow and learn, Elena felt a deep contentment that had nothing to do with having enough and everything to do with having exactly what mattered. She'd started this journey as an outcast widow with 5 unwanted children and no prospects beyond mere survival. She was ending it as a beloved wife, a confident mother, and a woman who'd discovered that love multiplied rather than divided when shared freely. The quiet rancher who'd called her his forever love had seen past her circumstances to her heart, and in doing so, had shown her and her children what it meant to truly belong somewhere. Together, they'd built not just a family but a legacy, proof that love could transform the most unlikely beginnings into the most beautiful endings. As Thomas led her inside their home, Elena took one last look at the star-filled sky above their ranch and whispered a prayer of gratitude for second chances, for love that arrived when least expected, and for the courage to believe that happy endings were possible even for outcast widows and forgotten children. Their forever love story was just beginning. 2 years after their wedding, Elena stood in her workshop putting the finishing touches on a christening gown for baby Grace, the daughter who had completed their family in ways none of them had anticipated. The delicate white linen was embroidered with tiny wildflowers that matched the ones growing outside the window, and each stitch carried Elena's hopes for this child who would grow up knowing only love and security. Grace had been born during a summer thunderstorm, arriving so quickly that Dr. Harrison barely made it to the ranch in time. Thomas had delivered his own daughter with hands that shook from emotion rather than inexperience, and the first sound Grace heard in the world was her father's voice whispering, "Welcome home, little one." Now 18 months old, Grace toddled around the ranch property with the fearless confidence of a child who'd never known rejection or uncertainty. Her older siblings doted on her with protective devotion that sometimes bordered on the comical. Marcus had taught her to identify different horses by their markings before she could properly walk. Samuel had already begun showing her which plants were safe to touch in his ever-expanding medicinal garden. Lily read to her every evening, fostering a love of stories that was already evident in Grace's rapt attention to picture books. The twins, now 7 years old and chattering constantly, had appointed themselves Grace's official guardians and entertainment committee. They created elaborate chalk drawings on the barn floor for her amusement and narrated her daily activities as if she were the heroine of an epic adventure tale. Elena paused in her sewing to watch through the workshop window as Thomas emerged from the main barn with Grace perched on his shoulders, her chubby hands tangled in his hair as she squealed with delight. At 36, Thomas had grown into fatherhood with the same steady competence he brought to everything else. But Elena had been surprised by the playful side that Grace had awakened in him. The man who ran a successful ranch with quiet efficiency became utterly silly when making his daughter laugh. The sound of approaching horses drew Elena's attention to the main road, where she could see riders heading toward the house. As they drew closer, she recognized Sheriff Davidson from Cedar Falls, accompanied by two men she didn't know. Her stomach clenched with automatic anxiety, despite knowing their legal situation was now unassailable. Thomas had obviously seen them. 2. Because he was walking toward the house with Grace still on his shoulders, his expression alert, but not worried. The years of building their life together had given him the same protective instincts Elena carried, but also the confidence that came from knowing they had nothing to hide. Elena left her workshop and joined Thomas in the front yard, just as the riders reached their gate. Sheriff Davidson dismounted with the careful movements of a man who'd grown older and wearier since she'd last seen him. "Mrs. Bridger," he said, touching his hat brim respectfully. "Mr. Bridger, I hope you'll forgive the intrusion." "Sheriff Davidson," Elena replied, noting how strange it felt to be addressed by her married name by someone who'd known her during her most difficult period. "What brings you all the way out here?" "Official business, I'm afraid, but not the kind you might expect." He gestured to his companions. "This is Marshal Thompson from the Territorial Capital and Mr. Harrison from the Territorial Education Office." Thomas shifted Grace to his hip, positioning himself slightly in front of Elena despite her obvious capability to handle whatever was coming. "Marshal." Thompson stepped forward with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, but not comfortable with social situations. "Mr. and Mrs. Bridger, we're here because your family has become something of a well, an example." Elena frowned. "An example of what?" "Success," Mr. Harrison interjected, his enthusiasm evident. "Mrs. Bridger, the report filed about your family situation 2 years ago has been circulated throughout the territorial education system. Your children's academic progress under Mrs. Mills's instruction, combined with the practical skills they've developed here on the ranch, represents exactly the kind of educational model we're hoping to establish more widely." Sheriff Davidson nodded. "And the legal challenges that were brought against your family have resulted in some significant policy changes. The Territorial Authority has revised its guidelines for evaluating non-traditional family structures." Elena felt a mixture of pride and discomfort at being the subject of official attention. "I'm not sure I understand what you're asking of us." Marshal Thompson cleared his throat. "Mrs. Bridger, we'd like your permission to document your family's story and methods. Not for public spectacle, but as a guide for other families in similar situations and for officials who might encounter comparable cases." "You mean other widows with orphan children?" Elena asked. "That, and families formed through adoption. Families with mixed heritage children. Families that don't fit the traditional mold, but are clearly providing excellent care and education." Mr. Harrison explained. "Your case has already influenced 3 similar situations in our territory alone." Thomas spoke for the first time since the introductions. "What kind of documentation are you talking about?" "Interviews with you and the children about your methods and experiences. Observation of your daily routines and educational practices. A formal report that could be used to train territorial officials in recognizing healthy family environments." "That might not look conventional." Elena looked at Thomas, who raised an eyebrow in the silent communication they'd developed over the years. The decision was hers to make, but he would support whatever she chose. "Could we have some time to discuss?" "This is a family," Elena asked. "The children should have a say in whether their story becomes part of official records." "Of course," Marshal Thompson said. "We're staying in town tonight and could return tomorrow for your answer." After the officials left, Elena and Thomas gathered their family around the kitchen table for what had become their traditional method of handling important decisions. Even Grace sat in her high chair, babbling contentedly while chewing on a wooden teething ring Thomas had carved for her. "So," Elena began, "it seems our family has caught the attention of the territorial government. They want to use our story to help other families like ours." Marcus, now 15 and taller than Elena, leaned back in his chair with the confidence of someone who'd grown up knowing his opinions mattered. "What exactly would they want from us?" They'd interview us about how we've made our family work, observe our daily routines, and write a report that other officials could use when they encounter families that don't fit traditional patterns. Thomas explained. Samuel, 13 and increasingly interested in formal learning, perked up with interest. Would it help other children like us find families instead of ending up in institutions? That seems to be the idea, Elena confirmed. Lily, now 12 and showing signs of the remarkable woman she was becoming, asked the question Elena had been wondering about herself. Would we have to talk about the bad times? About how people treated us in Cedar Falls? Elena considered this carefully. Probably some of it, yes. To show how different approaches affect families in situations like ours. Rose spoke up, her voice clear and confident in a way that still amazed Elena. I think we should do it. We're happy now, and if our story could help other kids be happy too, isn't that worth talking about the sad parts? Ruth nodded agreement. Besides, the sad parts are over. Now we can talk about them without being scared. Elena felt her heart swell with pride at the wisdom and generosity her children had developed. They understood that their experiences, both difficult and joyful, could serve a purpose beyond their own family. Marcus? Elena prompted. You haven't said what you think. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his expression serious. I think about the kids who are still on orphan trains, or in institutions, or with people who don't really want them. If our story could help even one of them find a real family like we did, then yeah, I think we should tell it. Thomas reached across the table to squeeze Marcus's shoulder. That's very mature thinking, son. Samuel, Lily, any concerns? Samuel shook his head. I trust you and Papa Thomas to make sure they tell our story right. And Mrs. Mills would probably help make sure the education part was accurate. Lily smiled. I think it would be interesting to see our family from an outside perspective. Sometimes you don't realize how special something is until someone else points it out. Elena looked around the table at these remarkable young people who'd grown. From traumatized orphans into confident, compassionate individuals. Then we agreed. We'll cooperate with their documentation project. The unanimous yes that followed was delivered with enthusiasm rather than resignation. And Elena realized that her children had reached the point where they were proud of their story rather than ashamed of it. The next morning, when the officials returned, Elena was ready with their answer and their conditions. We'll participate, she told them, but with some requirements. First, the children have veto power over anything that makes them uncomfortable. Second, Mrs. Mills must be involved in reviewing the educational portions of any report. Third, we want to see the final document before it's distributed to ensure our story is told accurately and respectfully. Marshall Thompson nodded readily. Those are reasonable conditions. We want this to be helpful, not exploitative. What followed were 3 days of the most thorough examination of their family life Elena could have imagined. Mr. Harrison observed Mrs. Mills conducting lessons, with all the children taking detailed notes on teaching methods and learning outcomes. He was particularly interested in how the children's individual talents had been identified and nurtured, and how practical ranch skills were integrated with traditional academic subjects. Marshall Thompson interviewed each family member separately, asking about their experiences before coming to the ranch, the challenges they'd faced, and the factors that had contributed to their success. His questions were respectful but thorough, and Elena was impressed by his genuine interest in understanding rather than just recording. The most surprising part of the process was discovering how much their story had already influenced policy. Sheriff Davidson explained that the Territorial Authority had revised its guidelines for family evaluations, placing greater emphasis on children's well-being and educational progress rather than conformity to traditional structures. 3 families in our territory alone have avoided separation because officials used your case as precedent, he told Elena during one of the interviews. A widower with adopted Native American children, an unmarried woman caring for her deceased, sisters' children, and a couple who took in 5 siblings to keep them together. Elena felt a deep satisfaction knowing that their struggles had served a purpose. Beyond their own family's happiness, Mrs. Mills was delighted to be included in the project, arriving each day with additional documentation about the children's progress and her observations about effective teaching methods for children who'd experienced trauma. "Elena," she said privately, "you have no idea how significant this is. Educational reformers have been arguing for years that children learn better in supportive family environments than in institutional settings, but they've had little concrete evidence. Your family provides that evidence." On the final day of documentation, Mr. Harrison made an unexpected request. "Mrs. Bridger, would you consider writing a manual for other women in similar situations? Your practical approaches to managing a large family, your methods for identifying and nurturing each child's individual strengths, your strategies for dealing with community opposition. These could be invaluable for other women facing comparable challenges." Elena was taken aback. "I'm not a writer, Mr. Harrison. I'm just a mother who figured things out as I went along." "That's exactly why your perspective would be valuable. Academic theories are useful, but practical wisdom from someone who's lived through these challenges successfully would be irreplaceable." Thomas, who'd been listening to the conversation, stepped forward with one of his rare broad smiles. "Elena, you've been keeping detailed records of the children's progress and your household management methods for years. You've essentially already written that manual. You just haven't organized it for publication." That evening, after the officials had departed with their documentation and their promises to share the final report before publication, Elena found herself in her workshop with a stack of journals she'd been keeping since their move to the ranch. What had started as simple record keeping had evolved into detailed observations about child development, educational methods, family dynamics, and community building. Thomas joined her, Grace sleeping peacefully in his arms after her evening. "Bottle, what do you think?" he asked, gesturing to the journals spread across her work table. "Ready to become an author?" Elena laughed. "I never imagined my life would take this particular turn. From outcast widow to published expert on non-traditional families." "You've always been an expert on family," Thomas said seriously. "You just didn't have the credentials society demands. Now you have both the experience and the recognition." As Elena looked through her carefully maintained records, she realized she'd unconsciously documented not just their family's growth, but a methodology that could indeed help others facing similar challenges. Her notes covered everything from practical strategies for managing large households, unlimited budgets, to emotional techniques for helping traumatized children develop trust and confidence. "I think I'll do it," she said finally. "But I'll need help with the actual writing and organization." "Mrs. Mills would be delighted to assist," Thomas suggested. "And I suspect you'll find the process more natural than you expect. You've been teaching and guiding people all along. This would just be a different format." 6 months later, Elena held the first published copy of Building Families, a practical guide for unconventional households, in her hands. The book, co-authored with Mrs. Mills and featuring a foreword by Marshall Thompson, had already generated interest from families and officials throughout the Western Territories. But more important than the book's success was what it represented. Elena Hartwell Bridger, once dismissed as an unfit guardian, was now recognized as an authority on creating strong, loving families under challenging circumstances. As she signed copies for neighboring families who'd supported them throughout their journey, Elena reflected on the remarkable transformation her life had undergone. She'd begun this story as a woman society had written off, struggling alone with children nobody else wanted. She was ending it as a respected member of her community, a published author, and the matriarch of a family that served as an example of love's power to overcome any obstacle. Thomas found her during the book signing celebration, sliding his arms around her waist as she finished inscribing a copy for Mrs. Thornton, the territorial supervisor who'd conducted their original evaluation. "Proud of you," he murmured against her ear. Elena leaned back against his solid warmth, watching their children help serve refreshments to the gathered crowd of friends and neighbors. Marcus was deep in conversation with James Bridger about advanced horse training techniques. Samuel was showing Dr. Harrison his latest botanical discoveries. Lily was helping organize the book display with the efficiency of someone born to manage projects. The twins were entertaining Grace and several other small children with an impromptu puppet show. "We did something good here," Elena said quietly. "We did something extraordinary here," Thomas corrected. "And we're not finished yet." Elena smiled, thinking about the letters that had already begun arriving from families who'd read advance copies of her book, asking for advice and sharing their own stories of building love from unlikely circumstances. Their house that had once been a refuge for one struggling family was becoming a beacon of hope for many. Elena Hartwell Bridger, the outcast widow who'd refused to give up on the children society had discarded, had become exactly what the world needed. Proof that families are built not by blood or convention, but by choice, commitment, and unwavering love. As the celebration continued around them and their children thrived in the security they'd created together, Elena knew their story would continue to inspire others long after their own chapter had ended. Love, it turned out, was indeed the most powerful force for transformation in the world, and their family was living proof of its unlimited potential. 5 years had passed since Elena's book was published, and the Bridger Ranch had become an unofficial destination for families seeking guidance and hope. Letters arrived weekly from across the Western Territories and beyond, many including requests to visit and learn firsthand about their methods. Elena had initially been overwhelmed by the attention, but she'd gradually learned to embrace her role as an advocate for unconventional families. This particular autumn morning brought an unexpected challenge that would test everything they'd built together. Elena was in her expanded workshop, now a thriving business that employed 3 local women and filled orders from as far away as San Francisco, when Marcus burst through the door with news that made her blood run cold. "Mama Elena," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger, "there's a man here from Cedar Falls. He says he's Lily's uncle, and he wants to take her back with him." Elena's hands stilled on the silk wedding dress she'd been beating. Lily was now 17, accomplished in her studies, and planning to attend the new women's college that had opened in Denver the following year. She was also secretly engaged to Dr. Harrison's nephew, a young man studying law who visited the ranch regularly and had already asked Thomas for permission to court her properly. "Where is this man now?" Elena asked, setting down her work with deliberate calm. "Papa Thomas has him in the front parlor. Lily's hiding in the root cellar, but she's scared. Mama, she doesn't remember having any family, and she doesn't want to go anywhere." Elena's protective instincts flared instantly. After 7 years, Lily was unquestionably her daughter in every way that mattered. But she also knew that biological relatives sometimes had legal claims that could override adoptive arrangements, especially when those arrangements had been made informally years earlier. "Get Samuel and send him to fetch Mrs. Mills," Elena instructed. "Then ask the twins to take Grace to visit Grandmother Catherine. I don't want her to be upset if this becomes difficult." Elena found Thomas in the parlor with a man she recognized despite the years that had passed. Harold Brennan was Lily's father's brother, a thin man with shifty eyes who'd run a moderately successful dry goods store in Cedar Falls. Elena remembered him because he'd been one of the few merchants who'd refused to serve her family during their difficult period in town. "Mr. Brennan," Elena said coolly, taking a seat beside Thomas on the settee, "I understand you have some claim regarding Lily." Brennan shifted uncomfortably under her direct gaze. "Mrs. Bridger, is it now?" "Yes, well, I've recently learned that my brother's daughter has been living here. I've come to take her home where she belongs with her blood family." And where were you 7 years ago when that child was put on an orphan train because no family member stepped forward to claim her? Thomas asked, his voice dangerously quiet. I didn't know about her situation at the time, Brennan said defensively. My brother and I were estranged. I only recently learned he'd died and left a daughter. Elena studied the man's face, reading the tells she'd learned to recognize during her years of protecting vulnerable children. Mr. Brennan, what exactly prompted this sudden interest in your niece's welfare? Brennan's hesitation told her everything she needed to know before he spoke. Well, I heard she's been getting a fine education here, learning refined skills. A young lady with such advantages could be quite helpful in a family business. Helpful how? Thomas pressed. She could assist with the store, help with the books, and attract a better class of customer. A well-educated young woman adds respectability to an establishment. Elena felt fury building in her chest. You want to use her as unpaid labor and a business asset. I want to give her opportunities with her real family, Brennan protested, but his tone suggested he knew how weak his argument sounded. The conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Mills's arrival, accompanied by Sheriff Davidson and, surprisingly, Marshal Thompson. Elena realized that Samuel had been clever enough to alert multiple authorities about the situation. Mr. Brennan, Sheriff Davidson said without preamble, I understand you're making claims about Lily Brennan. Lily Bridger, Elena corrected firmly. She was legally adopted into our family 3 years ago when we formalized all the children's status. Brennan's face flushed. Legal adoption? I was never notified of any such proceedings. Marshal Thompson stepped forward with an official folder. Mr. Brennan, according to territorial records, extensive efforts were made to locate any living relatives of all 5 children before the adoption proceedings began. Public notices were posted in newspapers throughout the territory for 6 months. No responses were received. I don't read newspapers regularly, Brennan said weakly. The notices were also posted in church bulletins and read aloud during Sunday services, Mrs. Mills added. Additionally, inquiries were made through business guilds and merchant associations. Your own store was contacted directly. Elena watched. Brennan's face grew redder as his claim crumbled under scrutiny. Be that as it may, I'm her uncle. Blood family has rights. Not when that blood family abandoned their responsibilities for 7 years, while others stepped in to provide love and care, Sheriff Davidson said bluntly. Mr. Brennan, what exactly is your financial situation? The question caught Brennan off guard. What does that have to do with anything? Because, Marshal Thompson said, consulting his folder, we've received information suggesting that your sudden interest in your niece coincides with some business difficulties you've been experiencing. Thomas leaned forward. What kind of difficulties? The kind that might be solved by acquiring a well-educated young woman who could help run a business without requiring wages, Sheriff Davidson said grimly. The kind that might involve arranging a marriage to a business partner in exchange for debt forgiveness. Elena's blood turned to ice. You're planning to sell her. I'm planning to arrange a suitable marriage that would benefit everyone involved. Brennan said defensively. Except Lily, Thomas said, standing to his full height in a way that made Brennan shrink back in his chair. The confrontation was interrupted by Lily herself, who entered the parlor with her chin raised and her eyes blazing with quiet determination. At 17, she'd grown into a young woman who combined Elena's strength with her own natural grace. And she faced her supposed uncle without a trace of the fear Marcus had described. Mr. Brennan, she said clearly, I understand you believe you have some claim on me. Brennan straightened, apparently thinking he'd found an ally. Lily, my dear, you've been living among strangers when you could have been with your family. I've come to take you home where you belong. Lily's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Home? Mr. Brennan, this is my home. These are my parents. These are my siblings. This is my family. You are a stranger who shares some distant blood connection. but has never shown the slightest interest in my welfare. But surely you'd prefer to be with your real family. My real family, Lily interrupted, is the one that saved me from an orphan train when I was 7 years old and scared and alone. My real family is the one that fed me when I was hungry, educated me when others said I wasn't worth the effort, and loved me unconditionally for 10 years. My real family is the one that sees me as a daughter, not a business asset. Elena felt tears stinging her eyes at the fierce loyalty in Lily's voice. Brennan tried a different approach. Lily, I could offer you opportunities these people can't. Marriage to a respectable businessman, a comfortable life. I'm already engaged, Lily said calmly, to a man I chose myself, who loves me for who I am rather than what I can do for him. We're planning to attend college together before we marry. College? Brennan sputtered. Young women don't need college. They need practical skills and suitable husbands. This young woman, Marshall Thompson interjected, has already been accepted to the Denver Women's College with a scholarship based on her academic excellence. She's also been offered a position as a teaching assistant, which will help fund her education. Elena felt a surge of pride. Lily had worked for this opportunity with dedication and intelligence, and seeing her dreams dismissed by a man who viewed her only as property was infuriating. Mrs. Mills spoke up for the first time since arriving. Mr. Brennan, perhaps you should know that Lily has been corresponding with educational reformers throughout the country. Her essay on innovative teaching methods for children who've experienced trauma was published in the National Education Journal last month. Brennan looked increasingly uncomfortable as the extent of Lily's accomplishments became clear. Well, that's all very impressive, but family obligations, what family obligations? Lily asked pointedly. Where were these obligations when I was sleeping in train stations and going days without food? Where were they when I was sick with fever and had no one to care for me? Where were they when I cried myself to sleep every night missing parents who were never coming back? Elena reached out to squeeze Lily's hand, proud of her daughter's courage in confronting this painful history. Mr. Brennan, Sheriff Davidson, said formally, based on the evidence presented, you have no legal claim to this young woman. The adoption was properly completed with all required notifications and waiting periods. Miss Bridger is of age to make her own decisions about her future, and she has clearly chosen to remain with the family that raised her. Furthermore, Marshall Thompson added, any attempt to coerce or abduct Miss Bridger would constitute kidnapping under territorial law. I trust we won't have any such problems. Brennan stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. This is ridiculous. Blood family should mean something. It does, Thomas said quietly. When that family acts with love and responsibility. When they don't, the family you choose means everything. After Brennan left in defeated frustration, the family gathered in the kitchen for what had become their traditional post-crisis discussion. Even Grace, now 3 years old, seemed to sense the seriousness of the situation and sat quietly in Alana's lap. Are there going to be more people like him? Rose asked, voicing the worry they were all feeling. People who might try to take us away. Elena considered how to answer honestly, without frightening them. It's possible, but increasingly unlikely. The legal adoptions make our family status much more secure, and you're all getting older and more able to speak for yourselves. Samuel, now 15 and showing signs of the man he was becoming, looked thoughtful. But there might be other children out there facing similar threats. Kids whose families haven't been formalized or who don't have the support we do. Elena felt a familiar stirring of purpose. What are you thinking, Samuel? I'm thinking that your book helps families that are already together, but maybe we need to do something for children who are still vulnerable to people like Mr. Brennan. Mrs. Mills, who had stayed for the family meeting, leaned forward with interest. What kind of something? A school, Lily said suddenly, her eyes bright with inspiration. A school specifically for children from difficult backgrounds. where they could get excellent education and learn practical skills while living in a safe, stable environment. Marcus nodded enthusiastically. And where they could stay together. As a group, like we did, instead of being separated into different placements. Elena looked around the table at these remarkable, young people who'd transformed their own painful experiences into compassion for others facing similar challenges. A residential school, she said slowly, the idea taking shape as she spoke. Where children could receive both academic education and practical training, where they could form stable relationships and build confidence. Thomas had been quiet during the discussion, but now he spoke with the careful tone he used when making important decisions. We have the land for such a project. The main ranch is profitable enough to support expansion, and Elena's business provides additional income. And we have the expertise, Mrs. Mills added excitedly. Elena's experience with family building, my educational background, your ranch management skills, Thomas. We could create something truly innovative. Elena felt the familiar mix of excitement and intimidation that came with contemplating a major new venture. It would be an enormous undertaking. We'd need approval from territorial authorities, funding, additional staff. But imagine the children we could help, Samuel said passionately. Kids who are aging out of orphanages with no preparation for independent life. Children like us who don't fit into traditional placements. Children who could learn that their past doesn't define their future, Ruth added quietly. Elena looked at Thomas, seeing her own excitement reflected in his eyes. They'd built something beautiful with their own family, and now they had the opportunity to extend that gift to others. Let's explore it, she said finally. Carefully, thoroughly, but let's see if we can make this dream a reality. As the family continued planning late into the evening, Elena reflected on how far they'd come from that desperate day when she'd faced losing her children to social prejudice and legal threats. Now they were planning to create a haven for other children facing similar challenges. Their story had begun with one woman's refusal to give up on unwanted children. It was evolving into a legacy that could transform the lives of countless children for generations to come. Love, Elena realized, didn't just transform the people who received it. It created ever-widening circles of hope that touched lives far beyond their original reach. Outside, autumn wind rustled through the trees they'd planted together, and Elena could almost hear the voices of future children who would find safety and opportunity on this land that had given her family such abundant blessings. Their greatest adventure was just beginning. 10 years later, Elena stood on the front steps of the Bridger Haven School for Children, watching the latest group of new arrivals climb down from the territorial wagon that had brought them from various orphanages and difficult situations across the Western Territories. At 53, her hair was silver-streaked and her hands bore the marks of decades of hard work, but her eyes held the same fierce protectiveness they'd carried when she first took in Lily all those years ago. The school had become everything they dreamed and more. 36 children currently called it home, ranging in age from 8 to 18. They lived in 4 family-style houses scattered across the expanded ranch property, each supervised by carefully selected house parents who understood that healing came through relationship rather than mere discipline. Elena and Thomas's original house had become the administrative center, while they built a new family home where Grace, now 13 and every bit as spirited as her older siblings, continued to thrive. Thomas approached from the main classroom building, his hair completely gray now but his step still strong and sure. At 48, he'd grown into his role as headmaster with the same quiet competence he brought to everything else. Though Elena knew the constant responsibility for so many children's well-being sometimes wore on him. How are our new arrivals? He asked, slipping his arm around her waist in the comfortable gesture of a couple who'd weathered decades together. Scared, hopeful, trying not to show either, Elena replied, watching as Marcus, now 25 and the school's livestock manager, helped a young boy with a limp carry his belongings toward the smallest residence hall. Marcus had never left the ranch, finding his calling in working with both animals and children who needed patient, understanding guidance. His wife Sarah, whom he'd met during a livestock buying trip to Colorado, shared his gentle way with healing and had become the school's unofficial counselor for children dealing with physical disabilities. Samuel, 23 and recently graduated from medical school in Denver, split his time between his growing practice in town and serving as the school's medical officer. His particular expertise in treating childhood trauma through a combination of traditional medicine and herbal remedies had earned him recognition throughout the territory. Lily had married her lawyer David 5 years earlier, and they divided their time between Denver, where David's practice was thriving, and the school, where Lily served as academic director during summer months. They had 2 young children of their own, and Elena marveled at watching her daughter navigate motherhood with the same fierce love and protective instincts she'd learned during her own childhood. The twins, now 17, were preparing to attend college together in the fall, Rose to study art therapy and Ruth to pursue journalism. They discovered that their early trauma had given them unique insight into helping other children process difficult experiences, and they developed an innovative program combining artistic expression with storytelling that had been adopted by several other institutions. Grace, the baby who'd completed their original family, had grown into a confident teenager who moved through the school like a beloved younger sister to all the children. She'd been raised understanding that their family's mission was serving others, and she'd embraced that purpose with enthusiasm that sometimes startled visitors. "The Robertson boy is asking about the horses," Thomas said, gesturing toward a thin 12-year-old who was staring longingly at the pastures where Marcus was working. With a group of children and several gentle mares, Elena smiled. "I'll ask Marcus to include him in tomorrow's session. Sometimes the best healing happens when children feel useful and needed." The sound of laughter drew their attention to the main yard, where Mrs. Mills, now in her 70s but still teaching, with undiminished passion, was leading a group of children in some kind of mathematical game that involved running and jumping, and apparently great hilarity. Elena reflected on how the school had evolved beyond their original vision. What had started as a residential facility for vulnerable children had become a comprehensive community that included not just education and housing, but medical care, vocational training, family counseling, and even a small teacher training program that drew educators from across the region. The territorial government had not only endorsed their work, but provided ongoing funding and had designated Bridger Haven as the model for similar institutions being planned in other areas. Elena's second book, Creating Safe Havens, A Guide to Residential Care for Traumatized Children, had become required reading for anyone working in child welfare throughout the Western Territories. "Elena," Thomas said quietly, "I have something to tell you." Something in his tone made her look at him sharply. After 28 years together, she could read his expressions like a well-loved book, and what she saw now was a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "What is it?" "I received a letter from Washington yesterday. The federal government is planning a new initiative for child welfare, and they want us to consult on developing national standards for residential schools." Elena felt her pulse quicken. "National standards?" "They want to study our methods and potentially replicate them across the country." "Elena, they're talking about creating a network of schools based on our model." Elena leaned against the porch railing, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Thomas was describing. That would mean ... It would mean traveling, consulting, training other administrators. It would mean our methods could help thousands of children, instead of just the ones we can serve directly. Elena looked out over the thriving community they'd built, thinking about all the children who could benefit from what they'd learned. Then she thought about the children already here, the staff who'd become like family, the delicate ecosystem of care and learning they'd spent a decade creating. What about our children here? Our staff? The school? Thomas smiled. That's the beauty of it. They want us to train others to run satellite programs while keeping this as the central campus. Marcus and Sarah could manage operations here. Samuel could oversee medical protocols. Lily and David could handle academic standards. We'd travel and consult, but this would remain our home base. Elena felt tears stinging her eyes as the full implication hit her. Thomas, do you realize what this means? A woman who was once considered unfit to care for 5 orphaned children could help shape how the entire country cares for vulnerable children. Not just any woman, Thomas said, pulling her into his arms. The woman who proved that love and determination can overcome any obstacle society puts in your way. That evening, Alina walked through the quiet school grounds, checking on the children in their various houses and marveling at the normalcy of it all. In one residence, she found the house parents helping younger children with bedtime stories. In another, older students were gathered around a table working on mathematics assignments with the patient guidance of one of Mrs. Mills's teaching assistants. The new arrivals were settling in with a mixture of wariness and hope she remembered from her own children's early days. The Robertson boy was already asking when he could visit the horses again, and a shy girl named Annie had been adopted by a group of older girls who'd promised to show her the art studio. Tomorrow. Elena ended her walk at the small cemetery on the hill where they'd buried Mrs. Mills 3 years earlier. The elderly teacher had worked until the very end, claiming that retirement was for people who'd run out of important things to do. Her gravestone bore the inscription she'd requested. She helped children discover who they were meant to become. I think you'd be proud of what we've built here, Alina said softly to the quiet grave. And I think you'd be excited about what's coming next. As she walked back toward her house, Elena saw Thomas on their front porch, Grace beside him as they looked up at the star-filled sky. At 13, Grace was already showing signs of the same fierce compassion that had driven Elena's own life choices, and Elena suspected that the next generation of their family would continue the work they'd started. Mama Elena, Grace called. As she approached, Papa Thomas was telling me about the Washington opportunity. Are you going to do it? Elena settled beside them on the porch swing that had held so many important family conversations over the years. What do you think I should do? Grace was quiet for a moment, her young face serious with consideration. I think you should do whatever helps the most children. That's what our family is for, right? To help children who need safe places to grow up. Elena felt her heart swell with pride at this young woman who'd absorbed the values that had guided their family for 2 decades. That's exactly what our family is for. Then you should definitely go to Washington, Grace said with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted that love could solve any problem. Because there are probably lots of children in other places who need families like ours. As they sat together in comfortable silence, Elena reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. She'd begun as an outcast widow with 5 unwanted children and no prospects beyond survival. She was ending as a nationally recognized expert whose work would influence how America cared for its most vulnerable children. But more than professional success, she'd built something even more precious, a family that understood love as action rather than sentiment. A community that proved healing was possible for even the most damaged hearts, and a legacy that would continue long after she was gone. Thomas reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining with the natural ease of partners who'd shared a lifetime of challenges and triumphs. No regrets? He asked softly. Elena thought about the woman she'd been all those years ago, desperate and alone and fighting just to keep her makeshift family together. Then she looked at what that woman's choices had created. A thriving school, dozens of children who'd found healing and hope, a model that could help thousands more, and a love story that had grown stronger with each passing year. No regrets, she said firmly. Only gratitude for the quiet rancher who saw past my circumstances to my heart, and who helped me build something beautiful from the most unlikely beginning. Above them, the stars that had witnessed their first tentative hopes now shone down, on a legacy that would outlast them both, lighting the way for future generations of children who needed to know that they too could overcome any obstacle with love, determination, and the unwavering belief that everyone deserves a chance to belong somewhere, that their forever love story had become something larger than either of them had imagined, a testament to the transformative power of refusing to give up on the people society had forgotten, and proof that sometimes the most extraordinary legacies grow from the most ordinary acts of love. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.